Hi, Alison, back again. I love researching family history, and one of the things that I like to do is read through old newspapers, and I have a subscription to the British Newspaper Archives, and I will just randomly look for things that maybe mention names of ancestors, or maybe I look at the places where they used to live. And I recently came across the most fabulous article, and it's all about a town called Longhoughton. Longhoughton is in Northumberland, and that is where a lot of my mum's family come from. And this is a retrospective article looking back on the history of Longhoughton. It was published on the 1st of December in 1864 in the Alnwick Mercury. Alnwick Castle being the one that was used in Harry Potter. So it might be a building that you're familiar with. Anyway, so Longhoughton is fairly close to Alnwick. It's certainly in that neck of the woods. And this article is written about the sort of place Longhoughton is. And it is a huge article. It is a one full page in the newspaper. But in particular, there are two points that the author draws the reader's attention to, and sort of two extraordinary vicars who are just brilliant, really. I wish that some of my ancestors had been featured in some of their parish registers, but anyway, this first article is fairly short. The second one is, well, part of the article is fairly short. The second one is a lot longer, and the author is called Burrell. And he says, Mr. Burretson hath been a vicar of Longhoughton for 20 years, and is no preacher himself. As examiner thinketh in regard, he never heard him preach at all. During the last 7 years, Mr. Burleton never procured any to preach there, albeit they have had many sermons, which the parishioners themselves procured. So they're having to pay for somebody to do the preaching because their own vicar won't do it. Namely to Mr. Stevenson, curate of Alnwick, who often came to them when he could be spared from his own cure. The other witnesses bear similar testimony, and it is further shown that Mr. Burleton, being newly come from Alnwick, was so overtaken with drink upon a Sunday morning that he could scarcely read one true word. But after endeavouring to read a homily, Mr. Whitehead and others were so much offended to see him in that state, they advised him to proceed no further. Often he was seen in Alnwick on market day, staggering up and down, and could scarcely stand. For 2 years past he had never worn a surplice when he read the divine service or administered the Holy Communion, and on being found fault with for this, he answered to Mr. Burrell, it was at washing. But when asked by Robert Adam, he said that it was spilled with ink and was ruined. He was asked to bring the item forth, and he had to admit that he had made it into 2 shirts. In his drunken freaks, he did on 2 successive Sundays proclaimed the banns of matrimony between himself and 2 other women. And for these very grave offences, Thomas Burleton was suspended from his office in benefice for 3 years. For his maintenance there was allotted to him out of the tithes and funds of the vicarage of Longhoughton £6 13 shillings and 4pence per annum. He also made a public submission of his offence in the parish church of Longhoughton in his ordinary apparel, but he was spared the degradation of wearing the penitential garment, a common punishment in those times for ecclesiastical offences. So he seems quite a character. The second part of the article, which I was particularly interested in, refers to another vicar who lived there a while later. It says, after a lapse of some 60 years, we find Longhoughton Church occupied by a singularly eccentric character, the Reverend George Duncan, who was vicar from the year 1696 to 1719. He had been previously curate of Alnwick parish, where he was so highly esteemed by the Common Council of the borough that they used their influence for the Duke of Somerset to obtain him the vicarage of Longhoughton. The register of the parish which he kept throws light on the opinions and character of the vicar himself. For as he records the births, the marriages and the deaths of the village, he frequently draws the characters of the persons who are buried, married or who have their children christened. Of some of his parishioners he speaks favourably, but generally his pictures are dark and unlovely. Forgetful of the charitable maxim Demotius nil nisi bonum, say nothing but good of the dead, he spares neither the dead nor the living. Evidently he was dogmatic, of strong opinions and cynical. He was warmly attached to his church, but had little regard to those who differed from him. As 134 years have passed away since the last entry was made by this eccentric man, and as moreover almost all of the families that are chronicled by him are now extinct in the parish, we may, without offending anyone's feelings, cull a few of the peculiar records in this register. So these are very unusual, that you would have a vicar writing about the characters of his parishioners. And they are, some of them are favourable in tone, some of them are moderate, some of them are not very nice at all. And this is according to the opinion of the person who wrote this article back in 1864. So, thus does it commence, Longhoughton. This register begins from the year in which I entered the ministry of this parish, which was Anno Domini 1696. The characters given by him are enclosed in brackets, sometimes expressed as Latin, sometimes in English. And as we shall see, the phraseology is exceedingly strong. Now, I don't have any Latin. I have to admit to having to use Google Translate for this bit. It obviously isn't the best, but I think it will give us a good idea of the exceedingly strong language that he was using. So we'll begin with the first one. Burials. 1696, Timothy Arkle, Whitesmith and Spurrier. And in brackets it says, Vald Senior, much older, of the coal houses. Next one, Edward, the son of William Tate, ancient farmer of Longhoughton. 1699, Margaret, the widow of Thomas Adams, one of the ancient and principal farmers of Longhoughton. 1700, Madam Mary, the wife, a most virtuous lady. Of Edward Rodham, Esquire of Little Horton, and in brackets it says, Valde impious, very wicked. Henry Gray, a very honest poor tailor of Longhoughton. Thomas Binion, an old haberdasher and freeholder of Alnwick, unholy. 1701, Francis William Reynoldson, one of the ancient farmers of Longhoughton. Robert Shepherd, Valde Senex et Calebs, very old and unmarried, one of the ancients of Longhoughton. Some in the subsequent records are simply said to be impious, wicked, but more frequently we find Valde impious, very wicked. In 1702, buried Elizabeth, the wife of Luke Pringle, who was no favourite. He is in other entries said to be triste impious, loweringly wicked, homo pesius, at worst, nequissimus homo, most worthless, and obstinately wicked. 1721, Roger Pearson, the wicked and obstinate, a hind of Longhoughton. A hind is a type of skilled farm servant. Right, 1705, John Ford, impious et impedia, wicked in energy. So maybe he's energetically wicked, I don't know. A hind of Seaton House. Several are described as worthless, but in different degrees. 1708, William Sanderson, a valde nequam, very naughty. Hind, so he's a skilled farm servant as well. 1710, James Flint, omnimodo nequam, was wicked in every way. A Webster of Longhoughton. A Webster, I believe, is a weaver, and he is afterwards a nequimous, worthless Webster. 1711, John Young, a nequissimus, worthless, long-time herd of Longhoughton. I'm assuming a herd is maybe a herdsman in a farm. We find the following extraordinary superlatives. 1713, John Robinson, very nequissimus, which means very worthless. He's a day labourer. 1712, buried, Robert Pringle, a malus filius male patris, bad son, bad father. He's a day labourer. In 1727, this Robert Pringle is a impi ignorans peccat, initially ignorant and sinful. He's a day labourer. In this year, there are some new terms introduced. William Gray, valde ignorans et obstinus peccat, very ignorant and obstinate. He's a hind. Henry Elder, in Felix valde nuptials, very unhappy nuptials. An ingenious smith of an ancient race of Longhoughton. William Chisholm, a salutus neglectus, so somebody who neglected their health, I think. He's a hind. William Wilson, trist impious, luringly wicked. A day labourer. Mr. Nicol Gray, vile malus, bad value, a butcher and an innkeeper. Ralph Dixon, an incurious of. Anne Wilson, Villas ebriosa peccat, a drunken cheap sinner. A poor mendicant widow of Longhoughton. A mendicant is a poor widow who makes their living by begging. In 1729, buried Isabel, wife of William Urin, militus maxim impi, soldier most ungodly, and June, Maxima Impia, most pious, the wife of Tam Impey, one hears, Thomas Week of Seaton House. The vicar, though generally using the Latin language, sometimes employs the vulgar tongue with startling effect. Brutish, wicked and ignorant are not unfrequently applied. We have in 1725 Thomas Gleghorn, a brutish barman, and John Marshall, a brutish tailor. Married 1706, Thomas Story, a very brutish and wicked fellow. Heard of Sharpley, and Mary Temple of Ellingham. 1724, Thomas Vardy, an obstinate, ignorant and wicked herd. Of Scrableys, 1722, John Robinson Senior is a very wicked and obstinate hardened herd of Beaumar. 1723, Helen Peat is ignorant and very ill, the widow of William Peat, an old collier and cottager of Longhoughton, and John Ferret is obstinate, ignorant and wicked cadger and day labourer of Beaumar. The Fishes of Bulmer and Seaton must have been a demoralised race. Of our register must have been strongly prejudiced against them. 1706, buried Barbara, the wife of Thomas Pennyman, a very ignorant fisher of Seaton House. And in 1710, he's a very old, obstinate, ignorant, wicked fisher. George Pollet in 1724 is brutish and unholy fisher of Beaumar, and in 1725 he is wicked and ignorant. In 1727, when he's married again, he is a trist ignorans et profanus peccat, luringly ignorant and unholy of sin, a fisher. George Strachan, vale salutus incurious, health and safety negligent, possibly, fisher. John Dow, a vile impious peccat, value wicked sin, fisher. Several others of Bulmer are said to be careless and ignorant. These sketches give but a dark picture of the moral condition of Longhoughton, yet there are a few better characters to save the parish. Some are described as honest or good. 1724, Henry Bell is an honest herd. 1706, Thomas Foreman is a very good man and an under farmer of Longleigh. Rafe Rubledge is pious and good of Little Mill. 1720, Joseph Kilgrice is a very serious good man, Webster of Longhoughton. 1723, buried Barbara, the serious good wife of James Gustard, an old and good herd. 1721, Richard Gustard, a knowing good man, herd of Longleigh. Now, Gustard is the family that I actually was researching. I haven't found a connection with either Richard or James, but I'm pretty pleased that they're the ones who are of good character in this village. Simon Dixon, a good, honest farmer. George Robertson, a serious, good collier. 1724, buried Patrick Dodds, a serious smith. George Gibson, a very religious day labourer. Nicholas Davison, a serious and religious herd. And Robert Bairnsfather, a serious, sensible and good day labourer. 1703, John Ditchburn is a Valde pious, very respectful, a millwright of Longhoughton. A millwright is a miller. 1704, John Robison is Valde probus, very generous. He's a blacksmith and a farrier. 1707, Robert Bowden is a probus et pious, a generous and respectful cowper. And a cowper is one who barters, deals, buys and sells, now chiefly in combinations as a herring cooper or a horse cooper. We also have 1711, Cuthbert Renwick, a probus et honestus, an upright and honest tailor. And Henry Robison is probus et sincerus, honest and sincere. 1726, buried Catherine, the wife of Nicole Truchet. Filia pia matris et uxar probi maritus, daughter was a loving wife to her husband, a collier. 1711, buried Mary, the wife of a very honest herd and an old and long oatmeal maker. This oatmeal maker marries again in 1714, and thus runs the record. Married William Elliot, a very honest herd and oatmeal maker, now in Harley houses, and Jane Hood of Denwick. In the following case, the character is a mixture of good and evil. 1705, christened Robert, son of William Thompson, honestus homini sed profanus Deo, best person but an unholy god, Milner of Little Milne. In two cases, the registrar lays aside his dogmatism and inclines to charity. 1707, Joseph Kilgripe, Spiro sincere pius, I sincerely compassionate, Webster of Longhoughton. In 1722, he is said to be probus et honestus ut spiro, an upright and honest I hope. But in 1720, this hope rises to faith, and he's called a very serious good man. The following miscellaneous extracts possess some interest. The registrar praises his wife, of whose pedigree he seems proud. 1701, married George Doncan, vicar of Longhoughton, and Margaret, the youngest daughter of Littleton Kerr, a very ancient baron in Tivertdale near Kelso. 1723, buried Margaret, the best of wives, the sister of Littleton Kerr, and ancient baron in Scotland near Kelso, wife of George Duncan, vicar of Longhoughton. 1711, buried George Gray, an old, innocent and fortunate fisher of Beaumar, a bachelor. Ginny, wife of William Gray, a quack and a warlock doctor of Longhoughton. In 1713, married Cuthbert Sappet, lame cobbler and schoolmaster of Beaumar. 1727, buried Isabel, the widow of John Morris, a very old herd here and there. On one occasion that register seems to lose courage. 1719 buried Thomas Adam, blank, bailiff of Longhoughton. A space is left for his character, which is not filled up. Perhaps that vicar, not inclined to say good, had not the hardihood to chronicle evil of so distinguished a personage as the bailiff. The most singular of the records, however, are those in which the vicar evidences strong attachment to his own church. 1699 buried Catherine, wife of Claudius Blackley, a mighty good churchman, hind of Little Horton. And when he marries again in the following year, he is a good churchman. William Thew and John Patterson, hind of Longhoughton, are honoured with the same praise. 1712 buried John Egdon, a very dissenter in his life and a very yet good charitable man. He was some years before his death brought to be a sincere member of the church, and when his wife dies in 1717, the record is Thomason, the good widow of John Egdon, the said good dissenter who came into the church. 1718 christened Eleanor, daughter of William Mean, now come from the dissenters, innkeeper of Longhoughton. Other dissenters, however, are not so gently dealt with. 1714 married Alexander Smith, a wicked knave and a dissenter. Webster of Longhoughton and Susan Davison. Richard Gladstan's herd of Longhoughton fares still worse. When in 1719 his son John is christened, he is called a Janus, so a two-faced herd. When his daughter Mary is christened in 1720, he is a Janus in religions. And in 1727, when his son John is buried, he is designated a Janus Tergivus Whig, herd of Little Horton. A Whig, it says, now the name of a political party, was originally the nickname of the Coventers of the southwest of Scotland, from Wigham, a word used by them in driving horses. The dissenters in Northumberland, being mostly Presbyterians, were called this name, and it is still occasionally applied to them in a jeering tone. For such characters, Little Horton must have enjoyed a bad notoriety, for in 1725 was buried George Hamers, a Tergivus Janus Whig, herd of Little Horton. This register presents a very unfavourable view of the moral and religious condition of Longhoughton parish, and as the bad characters rather increased than decreased towards the end of Mr. Duncan's ministry, the records tend to show that his influence over the people had been slight during the 34 years he was their religious instructor and guide of the parish. It may be, however, to be reasonably inferred by the dogmatic tones of the record that the vicar was cynical and prejudiced. Seldom, indeed, are such dogmatic judgments just. They are almost always based on narrow views, and doubtless they would all be greatly modified by taking the consideration of all sides of a character. We must try, however, to part from our eccentric vicar with some pleasant impression. His last record is kindly, and we may hope that he too died in charity with all men. 1729, buried Mary, the daughter of Henry Taylor, Valde Pius et Probus, a very kind and generous Webster of Longhoughton. I hope that you've enjoyed my little foray into the past, and I hope that you will join me again soon. Bye.